The lounge smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished wood, the kind of scent that whispered luxury. Outside, the bright afternoon sun spilled across the gleaming tarmac where planes stood like silver giants waiting to take flight. Inside, every detail of the VIP boarding area was designed to make passengers feel special plush leather chairs, quiet conversation, and the low hum of an expensive espresso machine in the corner. Naomi adjusted the cuffs of her tailored gray suit, glancing at her boarding pass for what must have been the fifth time in as many minutes. She wasn't nervous, at least, not in the way most travelers were before a long flight. Her mind was somewhere else entirely. She had just wrapped up one of the most important meetings of her career, and the phone call she'd taken earlier hinted that her work might be on the edge of something groundbreaking. But for now, she simply wanted a quiet seat in first class, some tea, and a few hours to think. It had been a long year. A year of fighting for recognition, proving herself. In rooms where her voice had been overlooked, and taking on projects that others had quietly hoped she would fail at. Yet here she was, boarding pass in hand, with a seat number that came with more than just legroom. It came with a sense of arrival. As the boarding call echoed over the intercom, Naomi joined the small line reserved for VIP passengers. The moment she stepped through the sleek glass jet bridge, she felt the hum of the aircraft beneath her feet. Inside the cabin, the lighting was warm, the seats wider, and the smell of fresh linen filled the air. She found her seat near the front, placed her briefcase carefully in the overhead bin, and sank into the plush leather, exhaling slowly. That's when she noticed the woman in the aisle, a flight attendant with a stiff smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was speaking to another passenger, a tall man in a crisp white shirt, his tone dripping with entitlement as he complained about being stuck in his seat. Naomi didn't think much of it until the attendant turned and stopped directly in front of her. "Ma'am," the flight attendant began, her voice polite but edged with something sharper. "We have a situation. This passenger has a special request, and we were hoping you might help." Naomi looked up, puzzled. "Help? How?" The attendant's eyes flicked toward the man behind her. "He was hoping you could switch seats so he could sit here instead. He's more comfortable." In this section, Naomi felt the weight of the words, "more comfortable." The man behind the attendant gave her a quick, dismissive smile as though he already assumed she'd agree. Naomi's fingers curled slightly against the armrest. She had paid for this seat, not just with money, but with years of hard work, long nights and sacrifices that no one in this cabin would ever see. "I'm sorry," she said evenly, "but this is my seat." The attendant's polite mask faltered. "I understand, but it would mean a lot to him. We can seat you in a perfectly good spot in another section." Naomi could hear the subtle shift in tone, the kind that suggested her refusal wouldn't be met kindly. "Still," she repeated, "no, I'll stay here." The man behind the attendant sighed loudly, muttering something under his breath. Naomi caught only a fragment, something about people like her. And just like that, the air between them changed. Before Naomi could respond, the attendant leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Look, I'm trying to be reasonable here. Please, just make this easy for everyone." Naomi's heart began to pound, not from fear, but from the sharp, familiar sting of being treated as though she didn't belong. She glanced around. A few other passengers were watching now, some with curiosity, others with that awkward avoidance. That comes when people don't want to get involved. She thought of saying nothing. She thought of letting it go, of giving up the seat to avoid making a scene. But something in her, the same part of her that had fought through every closed door and condescending remark in her career, refused to shrink. "I'm not moving," she said, her voice calm but final. The attendant's lips tightened. Without another word, she stepped away, returning moments later with another crew member. This one's expression was less forced, more pointed. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to cooperate. We can resolve this quickly if you just come with us." A strange, quiet tension settled over the cabin. Naomi's hands rested lightly in her lap, her gaze steady. "I'm already in my seat. There's nothing to resolve." The second attendant exchanged a glance with the first, then walked away briskly. Naomi could feel the eyes on her now, the whispers that passed between rows. She pulled out her phone, unlocked it, and scrolled to a contact she hadn't called in years. She hesitated for only a second before pressing call. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice answered, a voice that could change everything. Naomi? I wasn't expecting to hear from you. Her eyes flicked to the attendants at the front of the cabin, who were speaking in low, urgent tones. I think, she said quietly into the phone, you're going to want to know what's happening on flight 782 right now. A pause. Then the voice on the other end sharpened. Tell me everything. Naomi began to speak, her words low and deliberate. Each detail seemed to draw the person on the other end deeper into the moment. And when she finished, there was silence followed by a simple, chilling promise. Don't worry. I'll take care of it. She ended the call, sliding the phone back into her bag. Around her, the cabin still hummed with quiet tension, but Naomi leaned back in her seat, her expression unreadable. The attendants were still talking, but she knew long before they would that the next few hours would change everything, and somewhere a decision had already been made. One that would leave this flight crew facing consequences they couldn't yet imagine. But before that moment came, something else, something unexpected was about to unfold. In another part of the plane, a young black teenager was quietly offering his seat to a pregnant woman struggling to stand. He had no idea that his simple act of kindness would place him in the center of a story that would change his life forever. And, Naomi, watching the first signs of a storm she had just set in motion, didn't yet know that the day was far from over. The hum of the aircraft grew louder as more passengers filed in, finding their seats and stowing away their luggage. Naomi didn't move. She kept her eyes on the aisle, her mind replaying the conversation she'd just had over the phone. The calm, controlled tone of the person on the other end still lingered in her ears. She had called them for a reason, someone who didn't just listen, but acted. Someone with enough influence to make a situation like this one feel very small in comparison. She glanced to her left. Through the narrow opening between the seats, she could see the teenager she had noticed earlier. He sat quietly in an aisle seat, his backpack tucked neatly under the seat in front of him. He looked like he was traveling alone, maybe 17 at most. There was a tired but gentle look in his eyes as he noticed the pregnant woman standing. Beside him, her hand resting on the headrest for balance, Naomi watched as the boy stood without hesitation. You can take my seat, he told her, his voice steady and respectful. The woman blinked, caught off guard. Are you sure? She asked. He nodded, already lifting his bag. Yeah, you need it more than I do. There was a quiet murmur from nearby passengers, some approving, others simply observing. The woman thanked him softly, lowering herself into the seat with obvious relief. Naomi noticed the boy take a spot in a middle seat several rows back. Squeezed between two strangers, and didn't complain once. It was such a small moment, yet it felt important. Something about the way he'd done it without looking for praise, without hesitation, stood out in a space where so many people were absorbed in themselves. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, the two attendants who had spoken to Naomi earlier seemed to be arguing in hushed voices. Naomi caught snippets: protocol, passenger request, upper management, but nothing clear enough to piece together. Still, their nervous glances toward her seat told her she had unsettled them. Naomi shifted slightly, her mind drifting back to the meeting that had brought her here in the first place. It had been more than just another business deal. It was a project that could reshape an entire division of the company she worked with. She had flown in for a face-to-face with executives who were skeptical of her from the start. The deal wasn't just about money, it was about proving she belonged in rooms that had once shut her out. But now, this trip was turning into something different. Something personal. She thought about the man who had wanted her seat. He was somewhere behind her now, chatting with another passenger in a voice that carried over the low cabin noise. She could hear the smug confidence in his tone, as if he was certain the situation would still end in his favor. She wondered how many times in his life he'd gotten exactly what he wanted without question. The aircraft doors closed with a soft Thud, but the tension in the air didn't ease. A third attendant, one Naomi hadn't seen before, appeared at her row. Her voice was polite, but her posture told another story. "Ma'am, we've made arrangements for you in another section. Please follow me." Naomi kept her gaze level. "I'll be staying in my assigned seat," the attendant hesitated. "I don't think you understand." "No," Naomi interrupted gently. "I understand perfectly, and I've made my decision." For a moment, the attendant just stood there, then nodded stiffly and walked away. Naomi could feel the curious eyes of her fellow passengers, some supportive, some disapproving, but she ignored them. She was used to being watched. The engines began their slow, rumbling build, but Naomi could tell the crew's focus was split between preparing for takeoff and trying to decide what to do about her. She had no idea exactly how far the call she'd made would reach, but she suspected it wouldn't take long. From a few rows back, the teenager glanced toward the front of the plane. He seemed to be watching the attendants as well, though his expression was more confused than concerned. Naomi wondered if he had noticed the tension or if he was just curious about the delay. She decided she wanted to know more about him. People who acted out of kindness, without expecting anything in return, always caught her attention. There was something grounding about them, something that reminded her of who she wanted to be. Even in moments like this, her thoughts were interrupted by the chime of the captain's voice over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard and listing the estimated flight time. But before he could finish, Naomi noticed one of the attendants step into the galley and pick up the in-flight phone. Her eyes narrowed slightly, her voice low enough that Naomi couldn't make out the words. Somewhere in the pit of her stomach, Naomi felt the shift. This wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. She leaned back against her seat, staring straight ahead as the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway. She didn't need to look behind her to know that the man who had wanted her seat was still watching. And she didn't need to overhear every word to know the crew was making calls of their own, calls they would soon regret, because somewhere on the ground, in a quiet office far from this plane, the person Naomi had called was already moving pieces into place. The boy in the middle seat adjusted his position, pulling his hoodie tighter around himself. Naomi caught the small movement from the corner of her eye. She made a mental note to find him after they landed. Something told her his story was about to become tangled with hers in ways neither of them could see yet. Outside, the runway stretched, long and clear, the late afternoon light casting golden streaks over the tarmac. The engines roared, pressing passengers back into their seats as the plane lifted into the sky. But even as the city fell away beneath them, the weight of what was happening in that cabin stayed firmly in place. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath. She knew from experience that sometimes the most powerful moves were the ones made quietly, with patience. And right now, patience was exactly what she had. The boy glanced toward the pregnant woman he'd helped earlier. She was resting now, eyes closed, her hands folded over her stomach. There was a faint smile on her face, one of gratitude and relief. The boy looked away, almost embarrassed, as if he didn't think what he'd done was a big deal. But Naomi knew better. She had a feeling his act of kindness wasn't going to be forgotten. Up front, the attendants were still talking, their voices low but urgent. Naomi could only catch fragments, words like report, incident, and decision. She didn't need the full sentences to understand they were still deciding how to handle her. She kept her expression neutral, her hands folded loosely in her lap. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her unsettled. Somewhere, over the clouds, between the hum of the engines and the quiet shuffle of passengers settling in, Naomi realized that every person on this plane had just stepped into a story they didn't know was being written. And the ending? That was still entirely up for grabs. The plane had settled into its cruising altitude, but the air inside the cabin still felt heavy, like everyone was holding their breath. The seatbelt sign was off, yet only a few passengers moved around. Most sat still, glancing occasionally toward the front where the attendants moved with a certain stiffness, as if each step was weighed down by a decision they didn't want to make. Naomi kept her gaze out the window, watching clouds drift by, but her attention was split. Every so often, she could hear the faint buzz of the intercom in the galley, a murmur of voices that cut off quickly when the curtain was drawn. She knew they were still talking about her. What they didn't know was that every minute they delayed taking action, someone far more powerful than they imagined was preparing a response. The man who had demanded her seat sat a few rows behind. She could hear his voice occasionally, low but agitated, when he spoke to the passenger beside him. His tone carried a mix of annoyance and confidence, like he believed that whatever discomfort he was feeling was temporary. Naomi didn't turn around, but she could picture the look on his face, smug, certain, the kind of expression she had seen 100 times in meetings where people underestimated her. Meanwhile, further back, the teenager had pulled out a worn paperback book, its cover bent from use. He read with quiet focus, glancing occasionally at the pregnant woman he had given his seat to. She had dozed off, her breathing steady, her head resting against the side of the seat. Every now and then the boy adjusted his position so she wouldn't be disturbed by the occasional jostle of the plane. Naomi found herself wondering about him. Was he traveling for school? Visiting family? Or was this flight part of something bigger in his life? Her thoughts drifted briefly to the phone call she'd made before takeoff. She could still hear the voice on the other end, calm, deliberate, and absolutely certain in its authority. The person she'd reached out to wasn't just an acquaintance. They were someone whose name, if spoken aloud in the right circles, could shift the tone of any conversation. She hadn't planned to call them, not for something like this, but sometimes a single moment stripped away hesitation. One of the attendants approached her row, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers nearby. When they reached Naomi, their voice was polite, but the tension was still there. "Would you like something to drink?" "Tea, please," Naomi replied, her tone even. The attendant gave a quick nod, disappearing down the aisle. Naomi could feel the glance they stole at her when they thought she wasn't looking, as though trying to read her expression for any sign of weakness. She didn't give them one. Back near the galley, another conversation was unfolding between two crew members. One spoke in a hushed, worried tone about protocol and chain of command. The other's voice was sharper, insisting they needed to act quickly before things got bigger than they needed to be. Neither of them seemed to realize that the situation had already grown beyond their control. The boy in the middle seat looked up from his book when a flight attendant passed by. His eyes followed them for a moment, and Naomi noticed the way he seemed to be piecing things together. He might not know the full story, but he could sense the undercurrent of tension just like she could. Naomi took a slow sip of her tea when it arrived, the warmth steadying her. She knew this wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about the principle, the quiet but dangerous message that some people's comfort mattered more than others. It was about the way that message was delivered, with an expectation that she'd simply comply because it was easier for them if she did. She thought of all the times she'd chosen silence in the past to avoid confrontation, and how those moments had stayed with her longer than the ones where she'd spoken up. This wasn't going to be one of those silent moments. Outside the window, the clouds stretched endlessly in every direction, a soft white ocean beneath the plane. Inside, every conversation seemed to have an edge. The passengers who had witnessed the initial exchange were now stealing glances at Naomi, some with quiet approval, others with the kind of guarded curiosity people have when they sense something about to happen but don't know what. The pregnant woman stirred, blinking awake. The boy leaned slightly toward her. "You okay?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Better than I would have been standing." Her voice was warm but tired. "Thank you again," the boy shrugged. "It's no big deal." Naomi caught the exchange, the simplicity of it. To the boy, it wasn't a grand gesture, it was just the right thing to do. That small truth carried more weight than any seat in the VIP section could. At the front of the cabin, one of the attendants picked up the intercom phone again. Naomi couldn't hear the words, but she could see the way their shoulders tensed as they spoke. It wasn't routine. It was the kind of call where every sentence was measured, every detail chosen carefully. She leaned back, her fingers tracing the smooth seam of the armrest. She didn't need to overhear to know the conversation on the ground was already shifting. Somewhere, her contact was gathering information, asking questions the crew wouldn't want to answer. The plane hit a patch of mild turbulence, the overhead bins rattling softly. Most passengers barely reacted, but Naomi noticed the way the man behind her sighed impatiently, as if even the weather was an inconvenience meant to be fixed for him. Her phone, set to airplane mode, rested on the tray table. She couldn't see any updates yet, but she didn't need them to know things were in motion. Every instinct told her the real fallout wouldn't happen up here, in the air. It would happen when they landed. The boy turned another page in his book, but Naomi caught him glancing toward the front again. He wasn't the only one. A few passengers were clearly aware that something unusual was happening, though no one spoke it aloud. It was the kind of collective quiet that made tension feel heavier than noise. Naomi kept her eyes forward, her posture calm. She had no interest in giving the crew the satisfaction of seeing her unsettled. The truth was, she felt more in control now than she had when she first sat down. Because she knew something they didn't, this story wouldn't end the way they thought it would. And somewhere beneath the steady hum of the engines, a storm was still building, unseen but impossible to stop. The steady hum of the engines had become almost hypnotic, but the tension inside the cabin was anything but calm. Every small movement from the crew seemed deliberate now, every whisper carefully timed. Naomi could feel the shift in the air. This wasn't just awkward anymore, it was calculated. The attendants weren't simply going through their usual service routine. They were waiting, circling, as though a decision was hanging over the entire front section of the plane from her seat. Naomi could see the curtain to the galley swaying slightly whenever one of them slipped inside. Each time they returned with the same composed expression, but their eyes betrayed them. They weren't at ease. They were waiting for someone to give them the green light. The man who had started all of this still sat a few rows back, his voice occasionally rising in frustration. Naomi didn't need to hear every word to understand the tone. It was the sound of someone certain they'd get their way, the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of doors opening without question. He laughed once, quietly, like the situation amused him. Naomi didn't turn around. She knew exactly how he wanted her to react, and she wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. The boy in the middle seat shifted slightly, closing his book and resting it on his lap. His attention wasn't on the pages anymore, it was on the growing unease around him. Naomi caught his eyes for a brief second. There was no fear there, but there was awareness. Even from several rows away, he could feel the way this flight had changed from an ordinary trip to something heavier. The seatbelt sign chimed back on unexpectedly, though the plane was flying smoothly. A few passengers glanced up, puzzled. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm, reminding everyone to remain seated. Naomi knew enough about air travel to realize this wasn't about turbulence. This was about control. She could hear two attendants whispering in the galley just ahead, their words muffled but urgent. The tone was unmistakable. This was about her. Words like procedure and passenger report floated through, followed by a low, sharp response that made them both fall silent. Her hand rested loosely on her phone, still on airplane mode. She couldn't send or receive anything, but she didn't need to. The call she had made before takeoff had already put something in motion. She could imagine her contact on the ground now, with a phone pressed to their ear, speaking to the people who had the power to decide the fate of this crew long before the wheels touched down. The boy glanced toward the pregnant woman again. She was awake now, rubbing her lower back as if uncomfortable. He asked if she was okay, as she smiled faintly, though her eyes were tired. Naomi saw it how his small act of kindness earlier had given her even a little relief. That moment of quiet humanity contrasted sharply with the cold, transactional way the crew was treating Naomi, as if she were a problem to be managed instead of a passenger with the same rights as anyone else. From the corner of her eye, Naomi noticed the man who had wanted her seat leaning forward, speaking to an attendant in a low, insistent tone. She couldn't hear all of it, but his hands moved in small, sharp gestures, and his face was set in an expression of irritation. The attendant nodded, but their jaw was tight, like they were trying not to reveal just how much pressure they were. Then, without warning, another attendant approached Naomi's row, stopping just short of her armrest. Their voice was polite, almost too polite. "Ma'am, the purser would like to have a word with you in the galley." Naomi didn't move. "We can speak here," she said calmly. The attendant hesitated, their polite smile flickering. "It would be better if we spoke privately." Naomi's gaze didn't waver. "No, if there's something that needs to be discussed, it can be done here." There was a pause. Passengers nearby shifted in their seats, sensing the weight of the exchange. The attendant's lips pressed into a thin line before they stepped back, disappearing once again behind the galley curtain. Naomi's pulse was steady, but she could feel the anticipation building. The crew had stopped pretending this was nothing. Whatever they were waiting for, it was coming soon. She could almost feel the minutes ticking down, each one pulling the tension tighter like a drawn bowstring. The boy adjusted his hoodie, glancing again toward the front. Naomi could tell he was picking up on more than he understood, but there was no mistaking the alertness in his eyes. Somewhere deep down, he sensed that this flight was about to reach a turning point. The man behind her laughed again, soft, confident, as though he already knew how the story would end. Naomi didn't let herself react, but she could feel every muscle in her body tighten. She had been in boardrooms where people underestimated her until the very last second, and she knew the exact moment when the tables were about to turn. The captain's voice came over the speakers again, this time shorter, almost clipped. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask for your cooperation as our crew completes a necessary procedure. We thank you for your understanding." Necessary procedure. The words made Naomi's skin prickle. Around her, a few passengers exchanged puzzled glances. The crew began moving with more purpose now, their conversations brief, their movements brisk. Naomi sat perfectly still, her hands resting lightly in her lap, every part of her aware that the next moments would decide the rest of this flight. Somewhere in the back of the plane, the boy was watching. The pregnant woman was watching. Even passengers who had tried to ignore the tension earlier were leaning forward slightly. Sensing the edge in the air, the bowstring was pulled to its limit now. Whatever was about to happen would come fast, and there would be no mistaking it. Naomi took one slow breath and waited. The moral of this story is that kindness, courage, and doing what's right can change lives in ways we can't always see. Standing up against injustice, even in difficult moments, not only protects others but also inspires hope and respect.